we live in this society where social media are constantly shouting that we should want cars, money, women, pain relief, and pleasure creation. You start to experience this very, very deep sense of joy when you're not looking for some sort of reward. And I would say that's the closest thing to divine joy. It's a lie that pain relief and pleasure creation are the things that are going to bring you happiness. And the only thing that's going to bring you happiness is to embrace things like stress inoculation, intentional pain, intentional suffering in the service of the people that you love.
And here we are. So Jordan Adams,
That's
dude.
awesome.
Tell me how you got into Stoicism. And I want to preface this by saying Stoicism and and Christianity, in my mind, are so intertwined because it's based off like the laws of the universe, like objective moral truths, right? We observe these truths and then we act accordingly. And that's why Stoicism resonates so much with me. With that preface, dude, I want to know about Jordan Adams, and I want to know how you got into Stoicism, and let's start there.
So I'm a fitness and mindset coach. That's what I do for a living. I have you can call it a cult, I guess, of guys that I work with, and we're all obsessed about self-improvement. And we start with the nutritional aspect of becoming healthier to be able to kind of translate into virtue as an end in and of itself. I mean, the goal of the Stoic, the goal of really anybody is to be, to live with contentment, or within the frame of Stoicism, eudaimonia, which means like this deep human satisfaction. And that's really only attained through making and keeping really difficult commitments to oneself, right? Being congruent in one's values. So that's kind of what I do, is I coach men on learning how to become congruent with the things that they value, and maybe even understanding what it is that they should value. But in that process, I put a lot of content out, and I have no idea who it actually influences or who sees it. So it's encouraging. Yeah, thank you, Eric. Sometimes it's definitely encouraging to see that it does affect some people, because I just have to kind of throw it out there, and I do have to do it often, because we both know that the algorithm rules on Instagram, and if I'm not constantly putting stuff out there, then it doesn't get eyes on it, and so reels and posts and et cetera. So I appreciate that had some influence on you. I kind of echoed in a way, and I think I posted that similar thing on Facebook, but I included the lyrics of a Dustin Kensrue song. And Dustin Kensrue, singer for a band called Thrice, and a minister himself, I added, I think, to that the lyrics from his song Suffering Servant. He says, "The nations all shall hear and see, astonished at his victory. The kings of men shall shut their mouths in awe." And I added that to the end just because it kind of made it a little more profound. But so my history in Stoicism, it's kind of weird becoming a bit of a figure in Stoicism, and rubbing shoulders with people, because I initially encountered Stoicism in college at BYU in a philosophy class, and it was really like your basic Seneca, your basic Marcus Aurelius, your basic, even go back to Socrates, and the Socratic method. I didn't think much of it, but after I had a career in music, I decided I wanted to make money instead of music, which is, there's that trade-off there. It's like, okay, I can make music or I can make money. So I decided to make money. I got back into door-to-door sales in the solar world, and I founded a couple companies in that space. And I still participate with one of them that's based here in Florida, but I really was spending a lot of time coaching salespeople, which in door-to-door, most of the salespeople are men. And there seems to be a bit of a predicament in any type of high-ticket sales environment where you can make a lot of money. The problem is that money becomes the only aim. And typically, that doesn't provide for a very lasting or fulfilling career in sales. You typically have to have something that's bigger than money as an end to be able to sustain, high performance. And so I said, look, Stoicism actually would probably really help these guys in their mindset, in potentially rearranging their values so that as they're selling, they have something that is beyond just the money to drive them. Now, it typically went over everyone's head, because when you can go buy a McLaren when you're 25 years old from solar sales, you very quickly forget about what Socrates or what, Epictetus said or something like that. So kind of fast forward, 7 years of kind of using this as the tools and poring over all the texts, and reading and rereading and rereading, letters from a Stoic and meditations and Plutarch's Moralia and a lot of these different pieces here. I was working with a group called Superhuman Fathers, which is a similar quote unquote cult. If you ever look them up on Instagram, Kyle Carnahan's the founder, massive transformational coaching program that takes dudes, from gelatinous fat guys to just absolutely shredded dads who are willing to make massive sacrifices for their family. So I was a part of that group. I was probably one of the first three transformations with Kyle. And he's like, dude, you really got to coach on this Stoicism stuff because you just smash it with like, the mindset. And so he kind of pushed me into the coaching thing. And initially I didn't really want to coach fitness. I'm like, fitness is kind of my own thing. I kind of like doing it by myself. I don't really want to be out there on Instagram. And I engaged my coach, who is a guy named Wes Watson. And Wes Watson is like a big time, he's definitely, it seems on the outside, the peripheral, like he values stuff more than he values mindset. But if you really know him, the guy's absolutely congruent with his values. His mindset is 100% pure. And he pushed me into, hey, you got a fitness coach as well. So he helped me build this platform that is, based on nutrition and fitness and mindset. And we use Stoicism. We actually, let me put it this way. We use nutrition to teach Stoicism, because most people would say, oh, you probably use Stoicism to teach nutrition. I'm like, no, it's the other way around. Well, why? Going back to the concept of virtue, right? Virtue is what you do and say and think when no one else is watching you, right? It's the true self. So what better way to teach virtue than to make and keep a commitment that no one else cares about other than you? So when you're tired and you're hungry and you're stressed, you come back from the studio or from the office or from working a construction job and it's 7:00 at night and you want to engage in dopamine release, which is typically going to be accomplished through food, right? I want Cafe Rio or whatever it may be. Instead, you say, you know what? I'm actually going to exercise congruency to the things that I value, and I'm going to take up a notch in my virtue belt because I just kept my commitment to myself and no one was watching but me. No one cared but me, right? And when you do that one thing, which is actually one of the hardest things to do because no one's watching, because there's no one out there that's really saying, oh, it's bad to be overweight. Like it keeps you from being a better father, husband, man, provider, which is, the studies are profound and plentiful. But once you accomplish that, then all of a sudden you start to translate it to other parts of your life. Because that's kind of what happened for me is I started with macro counting and nutrition and then got in good shape. And then my business started to flourish because I started to apply those same principles. Then I started shutting off the TV. Then I started waking up earlier. Then I started being more and just like this snowball effect of virtue, which I'm far from virtuous, right? I mean, we're the joke of the Stoic is that none of us are Stoics. We're all just practicing to be Stoics. It's like being a Christian, right? No one's a true Christian. Everyone's just a practicing Christian, right? Practicing to be like Christ. But at the same time, it does provide a very, very practical set of tools to be able to employ to become more virtuous, right? And a lot of those tools can be found. In fact, if you look at modern therapeutic psychology, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll find that its ancestor is Stoicism, that the founders, who created CBT borrowed heavily from Stoicism. So Stoicism actually provides these real practical tools of like, hey, if you want a better life, employ these things. So that's kind of how I came into it. And I've been building this quote unquote cult, the Stoic Dad, which is men who are getting shredded. But the shred is not for the shred in and of itself. It's because that is a part of refining yourself to be the very best version that you can be as a father specifically, and as a husband too. And then thirdly, being that man that brings others to that table too. And it's my business as well too. So if a guy gets shredded, I get other clients, and that's always a positive thing too. Got to put food on the table. But that's kind of the history, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you, how does someone who's new to this and wants to improve, how do they relish and get to the point where that internal reward is enough? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's so you're basically asking a question that I talk about often. In fact, every podcast I've ever been on, my own podcast, like I kind of bring this up because it's a theory that I'm currently formulating. I'm writing a book right now, and part of it has to do with this concept of good as the end in and of itself, and how do you get to a point where that's even possible? I'm not sure that it's possible 100% as a human being. I do think going back to, the metaphysical origin of moral right and wrong, Christ, Jehovah, maybe Elohim, his father, do they live with that goal, with that end, with that mindset? Yes. I posed a question. I said, we hear that God is good, right? And what does that mean? And I was actually talking to a young LDS missionary. I probably blew his head off a little too hard there. He was just like at my dinner table. I'm like, what does it mean God is good? And he's like, well, God, I don't know. God gives good gifts. And I'm like, okay, that's a fair, definition of God is good. I said, but what does it really mean? What it really means is that God, in the absence of any other creature, entity, if he just existed by himself on a lone island in the universe, he would still act virtuously. He would still do something that is good because it's within his nature. He is virtuous. He doesn't need a reward. So the question is, how do we become that type of person? And you could say Christ was the same, right? In the life and mission of Christ, he did everything just because it was in and of itself good. He didn't care about the reward. He probably would have agreed to being completely, pushed out of existence if it meant that it was, to accomplish the goal of good, which in this case, or in that case, would be the atonement. So how does a man do that? That's a really, really good question. A lot of practice. I tend to compare a lot of things to the gym. So it's like when you walk into a gym and you want to hit 2 plates, that's 225 pounds, right, on bench. You don't walk in your first day and throw 2 plates on typically. Now, there are some phenoms. I would say if you're Tongan or Samoan, just by default, you can go and throw 2 plates on there. But if you're your average guy, you're going to walk in and be like, I got to start with 25s and then go to 45s, and then go to, a 45 and a 25, then eventually get to those 2 45s on there. So repetition is super key. So the best way to help a guy understand, number one, is he has to realign what his incentives are, what he truly wants. And that's, a lot of guys come to me and they say, I know I want something more. I just don't know I don't really know what that actually looks like. I don't think that it's the problem is that we live in this society where social media and television and music are constantly shouting that we should want cars, money, women, pain relief, and pleasure creation, right? That's what it's constantly shouting. So most men think that's what they want. They think that's the good life. Typically, though, that's broken down when they start having children. They start to realize, like, wait a second, these things are not bringing me happiness. In fact, hedonism is bringing me actually the opposite of happiness. In fact, let me just throw this in there because this is part of my theory. Is that let's just pretend that there is no God. Let's pretend that there's no Christ. There is no, metaphysical anything. It's just whatever the empirical is. It's right here in the physical world. So then it behooves us as this dominant species, as far as I know, we're the dominant species on the planet, to craft a set of moral imperatives whereby we ought to live, right? We say, hey, look, we've got to come up with some sort of rule system that's going to bring us the most amount of utility. If you go back to like economics 101, right? It's like, how do we create the most amount of marginal utility? Where everyone gets the most benefit? Well, then we have a lot of empirical evidence from thousands of years that service and sacrifice and kindness and goodness bring the most amount of benefit, and an equal, if not more plentiful evidence that hedonism brings the complete opposite, right? So for most people, it's very inherent to just wake up one day and realize, like, I'm not happy getting drunk and sleeping around and watching TV and becoming fat and gelatinous. Like, there has to be some sort of resistance. And, to quote, the Book of Mormon, Lehi, there's opposition in all things, And to be able to have that goodness, you have to have that, I guess you can call it evil. You can call it, the lusts and like the desires of the world against, those the higher things, the goodness of God that comes from stress inoculation and putting yourself through intentional pain and suffering to be able to find what you're looking for. So first and foremost, you kind of have to understand what it is that you want. I don't think you can walk into the kitchen and say, I want something better, unless you truly know what that better thing is. And to get that for some people just don't get it. There are some people I'm just like, I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to help this guy see that he needs something bigger and better. But for most men, it is inherent in us that we want that. So the very first step I would say is it's really good to like embrace some really basic readings. Some guys don't like to read. Audible's fine too, but there are some really basic books out there for listeners if they want to just say, hey, I need to craft something new, something that I can desire. So a couple books are good. How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. Donald Robertson is a homie. He is a great author, a psychotherapist from Scotland, spends most of his time in Canada now. But he goes through a psychotherapy session in the form of teaching about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. And he really does help men realign. It just kind of gets them thinking. That, and then also The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. I think Ryan Holiday is a fantastic portal for a lot of men today to get into Stoicism, which, don't even call it Stoicism. Just call it, morality. Just call it, logos. Call it what it really is. He's good at just presenting these ideas to the general public. So The Obstacle is the Way, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And if you want to get more quote unquote pedantic with it, you can get into Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, but really exposing yourself to some of these ideas. Like here's an example here. This is Marcus Aurelius 444. All that happens is just as ordinary and familiar as the rose in the springtime and fruit in the summer. So is sickness and death and slander and deceit, whatever else cheers or saddens foolish people. It's like, this is really basic stuff. It's like, hey, this happens to everybody. You're not a victim. Your suffering's not unique. You're not on an island. Everybody goes through this. And then all of a sudden you start to feel like, wow, I'm not alone. And this feels good. This feels right. And something about it, and this is kind of, maybe we do talk about this, but something about it feels very familiar, and feels very familiar for Christian people specifically, to a feeling that they get when they feel like what they would call the Holy Spirit. You know what I mean? Where it's like, oh my gosh, this speaks to my soul and it makes me feel emboldened and empowered. And I want more of it, right? That's a very similar feeling to like when you read scripture and you're like, this is true, this is good, I want more of it. So I would say that's the first access. If you want something like that, there's no reason in this day of, plentiful information why you can't go on. And I think this book is $11 on Amazon, and Amazon, I don't know, they have like drones that drop stuff off now, I'm pretty sure. So you can just buy it and go with it, get some good stuff.
I fully agree that reading is so essential to change our minds, change your mind, change your life. 100%, and I love the books you recommended. I think that one of the biggest battles that dudes our age are fighting is the constant barrage of digital stimuli, right? Numbing. We're afraid to be alone in our head for 5 seconds. But I want to know if I came to you and you were coaching me, I'm like, dude, my phone, I just got to get away from my phone. And yeah, you can say put it down, but you got to replace your phone with something else. So how would you coach someone to just break away from the incessant input that we are all barraged with? Yeah,
no, that's actually really good. We all struggle with it, right? There are times that I struggle with it. My whole entire business runs off of Instagram, so it's constantly I'm putting that input in there and looking for some sort of output. So again, it really comes down to when we first start talking to somebody. So let's say I had a client that came to me and said, I really struggle with just being on my phone all the time. Again, we have to first align the values, right? And so the value makes sense. You're like, I want to get off because. Why do you want to get off? Well, because I'm not present with my wife when I'm on my phone, right? Maybe I'm not aware of my children, or my 3-year-old's jumping up and saying, Dad, look at me. And instead I'm looking at my phone. So aligning the values is the very first thing. And then we have to, just like with anything else, take it back to nutrition. How do you execute a successful nutrition plan? By planning. You absolutely do have to have a plan around it. And that's really any type of success in life. So I was just talking to one of my high-level clients the other day. He is a flight surgeon currently in Saudi Arabia. And we were talking about he's getting prepared to go home. And he's kind of been living the bachelor life for the last 4 months on this deployment. He's going to go home and have to get back into dad life. He's got, 4 kids and a practice to run and a wife that he has to actually pay attention to when he gets home. And the phone is a distraction. So we actually came up with a couple different plans, and it has to be reinforced with some sort of self accountability, right? I can't necessarily go and smack the phone out of their hand for them. And then also some daily reporting to me as well. So I said, look, let's do this. Let's set some times where it's okay to be on your phone. Let's set some times that it's not okay to be on your phone. And then there's a couple of apps that you can use that will actually lock your phone as well too. And it's sad that we actually have to even talk about that, because it's like we're so tied to this device that's part of our hand that we have to resort to using some of this stuff. And it can be helpful for, multitude of different things. But we're using a couple different apps that will basically shut down usage of the phone after a certain time. So having the plan and then having some sort of stopgap or some sort of mechanism in there to be able to stop you from using it. But I am a big believer beyond those things, because those are kind of the peripheral things. I'm a big believer that if you can craft a big enough, I guess the best word is why that people are going to understand. If you can craft a big enough why, then I'm a big believer that you will typically find any how to accomplish that. And so if you really boil it down to, I really just want to be more present with my wife and children, and you have some of those mechanisms, some of those more peripheral things that you can employ, like a phone lock, like putting it into your schedule, and also sharing it with your wife. It's totally okay. I think us as men, we tend to feel like we're vulnerable when we overshare some of, our more like vulnerable goals with our spouse. It's totally okay to go to your wife and be like, you know what, honey, I'm really, really trying to be very, very present. And I want to be off my phone at these times. These are the times that I'm working. These are the times that I'm not. Will you help me in that thing? And not will you help me like be my mommy, but will you just help me and make sure, like it's totally okay to very, very pointedly call me out and say, hey, you said you weren't going to be on your phone that time. And number one, she's going to love you for it. She's going to be like, okay, my husband's really trying. So her level of trust in you is going to skyrocket. But I would say a threefold plan like that. Number one, you have to have the plan, which is going to stem from the values of what you want. And then you have to put in place some of these mechanisms. And then for me, again, if I'm coaching somebody, that's something that I kind of put into my file for them. So every time that we communicate, on our official level, maybe that's once a week, I say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's see what you did. Let's see how you did. And what do we need to do to tighten that up? And again, it's about consistency. So the longer you do it, the more it becomes part of you. Like when I first started work, I wake up at 3:50 in the morning every single day. And I just started doing it, and it still sucks. It's still difficult. There's never a day that I wake up that I'm like, man, I'm really, really happy to wake up at 3:50, but I'm happy hours later, So it really takes repetition, but I would say it's got to be like a 3 or 4-fold plan.
I think that's fantastic. What I keep hearing you saying there was values. And one of the most powerful things I did was I don't remember which Stephen Covey book it was, maybe 7 Habits, but he talked about writing a mission statement. And what that did, I wrote that out, and that helped me identify my values, and I should re-update. But actually writing them down for me, writing out why, and making kind of a hierarchy of these values, that has been a big change for a why for me to like start. And I would love to know your opinion on that, of how important it is to like really identify your values and how you come to that.
Yeah, it's very important. So I actually have mine written down as 4 maxims. So I did like a nice little design on them. I keep them on my phone. Sometimes I'll have them where they're like the background on the new one. I think you can have multiple different backgrounds and stuff. So I put these values on there, and in regard to developing those and keeping those on self. I mean, there's again plenty of studies to show that if you have a piece of paper on you with your values or your goals, the likelihood of you accomplishing those goals is much higher, right? So I think a lot of people tend to view things, maybe like we feel like embarrassed sometimes to do that, right? We're like, that's kind of extreme, or like, that's kind of like going too far, right? If I actually have to write them and keep them on me. One of the reasons I have a lot of tattoos is actually because of that. Maybe I'm extreme because I have them tattooed on me, but like, for example, like, I'm really driven by certain members of my family. My great grandparents and my grandmother were all incarcerees of Japanese internment during World War II. So my grandmother's full Japanese, so I'm a quarter. And so my family overcame a lot of hardship and came out of it very, very well off. When my great grandfather died in the year 2000, he was very, very wealthy from being a strawberry farmer, just being kind of that hardcore, that generation of guys born like 1910. And so I have like my family symbols, tattooed on me. This is like they call this a komon, which is like a family crest, so I have things to remind myself. And I think that's a good way to kind of go about it. Maybe not I mean, you don't have to, I don't care if you have tattoos. I have a lot of them, but it's like something that can remind you of your values first. So like one of the beautiful things we have is we have a smartphone and you can choose any background that you want. Or if you have an Apple Watch, you can choose any background that you want, and so you can basically plaster your values all over everything, anywhere, anytime. And so you don't have to feel so embarrassed. But to take it a step further, I would say that it is more effective too to carry on your person maybe a piece of paper, folded, laminated. Maybe it's something where it can be permanent, and you just carry that with you to remind yourself, or you have some sort of reminder that can help you kind of draw your attention back to your values. So the importance. Vital. It's vital because how easy is it? I mean, we're like Doug from the movie Up, Squirrel, we get so distracted so quick from our values. We see something shiny. We see, it's like, I'm really good at my diet until I go to the grocery store and then I'm completely, out of whack.
That's what I love about Stoicism is you realize we owe ourselves and our integrity to the greater good, to the whole, and it's like, it's bigger than us. And when we accept that it's bigger than us, we just open ourselves up so wide to accept more love, to give more love, and then feel a sense of duty to our fellow men.
Yeah, totally. No, I think it's important to have those symbols around us. I actually wear a memento mori necklace as well. It has a little skull and crossbones on there just to remind myself, of that constant need to remember that death is coming. But a more practical thing that I do too is I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 alarms set for my day every day. So I have my wake up alarm, and then I have 8:10, 100% on your macros. 9:15, you're totally capable of whatever you set your mind to, 100%. 10:01, remember your purpose. 10:20, remember why you're doing this. 11:05, moderation, wisdom, dedication. 12:25, this is attainable, stick to your plan. So I just have all these reminders. So it's totally okay, because I think a lot of listeners want to know what's a really practical tool. We have this really powerful supercomputer that we don't want to be tied to, but at the same time we're going to, whether we like it or not.
Dude.
So use some of these things,
Our phone is a tool. It's not good or bad, and I love that you take initiative to make it a powerful tool. Okay, I want to talk about something that is so important to me. How do you take those failures and resistance and you mess up, and how do you make them so you're not, I'm a piece of fat trash and I messed it all up? How do you do it where it's like, okay, I'm going to keep going, and you make it so you're not defeated?
I was just talking about that this morning on my Instagram about being present, because most people, they don't live presently. They live heavily in the past or heavily in the future, right? And the past is typically lamentations, right? It's like, man, I'm such a piece of crap. Therefore, I'm incapable of acting right now in the future. Or I'm so unsure and in fear of the future that I can't act presently, because I'm just crippled by what might be, right? And so that's, what's interesting about Jesus Christ is I don't ever remember Jesus Christ ever saying you suck for the past. I don't think it exists anywhere, right? It's very much a man-made idea. And so how do you do that? Well, Stoicism, it stresses a couple different really cool principles. One of those principles is memento mori, and it's traditionally viewed as remember that death is coming, but it also stresses that remember that the past is dead. And it reminds you to live presently, because the past, there's just... I don't think there's a time machine. I've never seen one. I don't know anyone who's traveled in time before and gone into the past. So even what happened 5 minutes ago cannot be relived. It can be potentially re-represented. You could maybe craft something that that, to try and repeat that, but it's not a true repeat, right? It's nothing can be relived. And so sometimes we tend to look at the past, really beat ourselves up for our sins of the past without realizing that there's nothing we can do about it. And that would fall into what's called the dichotomy of control, which you're familiar with, right? Dichotomy of control is a massive principle within Stoicism that says the only thing that you can control is your perceptions, therefore your thoughts and your judgments, and therefore your actions. You can't go back in time and change that. So how do you act? Act presently, right? And I think within Christianity, you could tie that to the concept of not wallowing in one's sins, right? In fact, if anything, the scriptures say, get over it, stand up, go to work. There's no reason to sit around and cry over the spilled milk. There's nothing you can do to change it. And I think in a lot of Christian faiths, especially within like the LDS framework, there tends to be this idea of, I'm such a piece of trash, and you hear it a lot, right? And it's like, I don't remember anyone saying that you're a piece of trash. And I don't remember, certainly not the Savior, maybe not some church leadership, maybe a local leader said you're a piece of trash. I mean, that's whatever, but at the end of the day, we tend to really beat ourselves up and dwell on the past, which really limits our ability to be effective in the present. And so I would say memento mori, understanding that the past is very much dead and it cannot be relived. So we have to radically accept that. And then understanding that we can only control what we can control, which is in the present. We cannot control the past. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to have to pay for things in the past, right? There are mistakes that we make, and that's going to carry over into our present, and we do have to face those consequences. But that still doesn't mean that we can live in the past, right? That's a present consequence of a past action. So we're still forced to live very brutally in the present, right? And so you have to just radically accept that. And that's actually a tool of cognitive behavioral therapy, radical acceptance. They say, look, you have to understand that there's just not a damn thing you can do about it. And that's hard for most people to do. So how do you do that? You practice it again and again and again and again and again. And that's hard for some guys, because some guys say, well, how do I do this? I'm like, well, you have to practice it. And they're like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, you have to practice it. That sucks, right? To realize that there's no shortcut to like inputting. And maybe with like Elon Musk's Neuralink that's coming, maybe you can just input a behavior into your brain and it'll solve that issue for you. You know what I mean? But it does just take continual application. And within Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy, they talk about creating what's called cognitive distance. And cognitive distance is almost as if looking at your day or your actions from a distance. You have to separate yourself, pull yourself back, kind of like doing like a breath check. You know what I mean? You're like, okay, what's my breath like? You know what I mean? Let me check a nose check. You know what I mean? Let me see if I got anything in my teeth. And so it's very similar to that, but on a larger scale of taking a step back, taking note of what you're doing, what you're saying, watching your actions and your thoughts, watching your words, and finding areas where you're like, okay. And there's a couple different tools for that. Journaling is very valuable to be able to do that, right? To kind of go back and be introspective about the previous day and say, here are some areas that, I sat around and kind of pouted about the past and I need to change that for tomorrow. I don't know that you can really do that unless you're, very much, unless you're committed to practicing something like journaling or something like a daily, recollection of the events. And there's some, actually, again, going back to practical tools, there's some really good tools. One of the apps is actually called Stoic. So there's an app called Stoic, period. And it's a journaling app that will basically take account of the day. How did it go? How did you feel? And it'll ask some very, very deep introspective questions. And some of them, that are related to, understanding, helping you gain some cognitive distance and go through the day. So I would say that, that's probably the most practical way to do that. You know what I mean? And to really understand, like, unless I'm aware and I'm making myself aware through some of these tools, because I'm very much like a get in the mud and find something that's very much like instead of being abstract, because I think guys struggle with abstract tools, right? Where you just say, well, just think about it, And it's like, well, I can't. Yeah, I can't. It's like, okay, well, here are the things that you can actually do. Give me something solid that I can do on a daily basis. So I would say employing some sort of journaling regimen where you're able to create some cognitive distance and looking at your day. And then in that moment, when you feel yourself wallowing, you just have to practice that concept of radical acceptance and say, okay, to date, there is no time machine. So I just have to let that go and move forward and understand from a Christian perspective. Like, I think that there's plenty of evidence, in fact, of Christ saying, hey, go your way and sin no more. In fact, that's what he did say. He never said, go your way and really dwell on the past. He said, just go your way and sin no more. And so understanding that concept, I think, really helps me. And then also, like, for me, this is a really practical tool, for me at least. I tend to look at historical figures, whether it's within my own faith or it's within, the greater Christianity as a whole, and really look at like how flawed they are. Like, I always joke that Moses killed a guy and hid the body, you know what I mean? So I kind of remind myself of those things. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm actually pretty good for the most part. I've never killed a guy and hid the body, you know what I mean? And I've never, done a lot of these weird, kind of strange things that other people have done. If I'm measuring myself by those standards, I feel like I'm actually doing pretty good. So those are just some practical tools that I would recommend.
Those are fantastic. I really love journaling and reflection. I think that helps a lot. I want to ask you, what is your daily practice with the divine?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. My communion with God really happens. One of the reasons I wake up at 3:50 is my communion with God really happens in the silence. And it makes me think about in 2 Samuel or 2 Kings. I think it's either 2 Kings or 2 Samuel, right? But God was not in the wind or God was not in the earthquake. I think it's in either one of those Old Testament books. But this concept that God is not in this great event, he's typically in the still, small silence that exists when my kids are asleep. My kids don't wake up until like almost 7 o'clock in the morning. It's when I'm driving to the gym. I typically will turn on. So I wake up at 3:50. I'll typically do some reading right when I get up, and that's either from a book like Meditations, or I might read from the New Testament, or I might read from like my Heroic app, which has access to a lot of that stuff. And then where my communion really happens is I will prepare my gym drinks. Typically like some pre-workout, and something with caffeine, and then get in my car. And I typically will turn on classical music, and typically in the form of Mari Samuelson, who's an amazing violinist, and she does a lot of stuff with like Max Richter. So like some sort of Max Richter-esque, I wouldn't call it somber, but very much of like a calm music, in preparation to go listen to death metal for 2 hours. But, so I sit in my car and I'm driving. It's about a 20-minute drive to the gym. And that is where I feel that calmness and that stillness. And that's actually a principle of Stoicism, to seek out stillness and to seek out that calmness. And so my daily, communion is, and where I probably pray the most, is in that time while I'm driving, where I'm feeling that feeling. I'm not a big proponent. Like I've heard a lot, pray until you feel like praying. There's sometimes it's just not working for me. You know what I mean? But if I can prepare the environment well enough, then I feel like I can commune with the divine a lot more effectively. And I've always just been the weird guy that prays in my car. It's the one place where it's like I don't feel like I'm distracted by other things. Even when I was like a missionary, I would kneel down, I'd be looking at something in my bed or whatever. Like, I'm kind of distracted. Whereas when I'm driving, it really brings a lot of that silence to me. But certainly when you're driving at 4:30 in the morning, no one's on the road, right? You see the beauty of the earth for what it is. Here in Florida, we get this morning fog, and I'm driving through this morning fog. We kind of live out in the country. So there's no one on the road. It's dark. It's silent other than the classical music that's playing. I just read something, that was inspiring. And in that moment, while I'm driving, that's when I feel the divine. And that's when I feel that inspiration that comes to me. And that's when I feel that strength that says, hey, you've made a good decision. This is exactly what I want from you. This is exactly what you should be doing. This mission that you're on to save other men, and even just going to the gym to put your body through stress. These are good things. And I feel that confirmation. And for me personally, they talk about the fruits of the Spirit. When I feel God, I feel this very strong affirmation of like duty, and it's really hard to explain actually. It's like very emboldening, like this feeling of like I'm giving you strength, and like you're doing this for a reason. It's not so much like those more emotional feelings of like where it makes me want to cry. It makes me want to like go like dig up a mountain or like build a house. You know what I mean? It's like this feeling of like empowerment, like, and that's really what it is. It's empowering. So one of the reasons I wake up so early is because it gives time for that. When you're waking up at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, you're kind of rolling out of bed and you're in a rush, you're not going to find the time to really commune with the divine, to pray and to study and to experience that silence and that stillness. So I do encourage, and I do encourage all my clients, that's one of our tenets is wake up early, go to bed early so that you can wake up early. Right. And find that time to commune. And it doesn't have to be, at least in my mind, your traditional type of prayer, right? You don't have to get on your knees per se and say the same words. Sometimes it's just about talking to God. Sometimes it's just like, there's a really good talk given by a guy named Hubie Brown called "Father, Are You There?" And he talks about how that was his prayer in so many different cases. Father, are you there? Father, are you there? Right? Just reaching out to God, reaching out to the divine, asking if he's there, and saying whatever you need to say, and having a real, sincere conversation with him. And sometimes that's audible and sometimes it's not, but preparing yourself through the correct environment and setting aside the time, for me, that's the only way, to be honest. If I'm ever rushing, if I ever haven't put it in my plan, it will never happen. And so we can't expect it to happen. A lot of guys are like, they want anything to fall in their lap. I want good nutrition. I want a better relationship with God. I want to be more present, but I'm wanting it to fall in my lap. That's just not the way it works.
Dude, that is so great. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. Dude, I felt that empowerment, man. I want to go do good stuff. Is there anything else you want to say to our fellow brothers out there before we end?
Yeah, man. I'll say this. Number one, you guys are all so capable of becoming the best version of yourself that you want to be. And it's a lie of, call it the adversary, call it, the greater opposition as a whole that tells you that pain relief and pleasure creation are the things that are going to bring you happiness. And the only thing that's going to bring you happiness is to embrace things like stress inoculation, intentional pain, intentional suffering in the service of the people that you love, which for all of us is our wives and our children, right? And to do without, like you said, without the pat on the back. Do the dishes because they need to be done, wipe the kids' butts because the kids' butts are dirty, you know what I mean? And serve your wife because that is in and of itself a good thing. And you will find that you start to experience this very, very deep sense of joy when you're not looking for some sort of reward. And I would say that's the closest thing to divine joy, because that's the joy I think that God has. He does these things because they are in and of themselves good. And I don't know that we can obtain that completely in this life, but I think that we can get very close to it. The other thing I would say is join a men's group. It doesn't have to be my group. You can find me at the Stoic Dad _. On Instagram, but like Superhuman Fathers is a great one. Dad.work is another one. Kurt Storing, an amazing men's coach out of Canada. There's just so many out there. And men specifically, guys, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to come to a group and say, you know what, I need help. I'm struggling. I need a better set of values, and I need other men to be able to talk to, because your wife doesn't want another son. Your wife doesn't want to be your mama. She wants to be your wife. She needs you to lead. She needs you to be virtuous. She needs you to be consistent. And so far, I mean, I'm part of a larger men's group as well, outside of my group. So find something like that. In addition to, I get that a lot of you are faithful Christians. You go to your church. Outside of that, something in addition to that you can be a part of that can hold you accountable and bring you some sort of clarity on what your values are. Because when you see other men starting to align their actions with your values, it's just that compounding effect that you're going to start aligning your actions with your values as well. So if you feel so inclined, follow me at the Stoic Dad _ on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. I'm not as active on TikTok. and start valuing things because they are in and of themselves good. Which again, I'm not saying that I'm there yet. It's definitely like a lifelong journey for me. But you will find that your level of happiness starts to increase when you stop valuing the wrong things. So I think that's what I would love for people to know.
Oh, dude, you are a stud. You are a breath of fresh air. Thank you so much. Also, Jordan, you have a podcast. I actually listened to your last episode. It was awesome. And I recommend everyone go listen to Jordan's podcast. All right, Jordan, thanks for being on the podcast, man. Looking forward to more conversations in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric, for having me. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. More importantly, I hope you feel closer to your Creator. If you find yourself wanting to strengthen your relationship with God, I'm a huge fan of the Skylight app. It's full of beautiful, high-quality daily spiritual practices. Finally, never forget, in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him.